Okay. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our fireside chat. We are super excited to be joined by this all-star panel of early childhood enthusiasts. And I'm joined by, of course, Mike Petrich from the Exploratorium, and Ihuoma Iheukwumere, who is a child educator, early childhood educator with the Trans Bay Child Development Center, south of Market Childcare in San Francisco, and Raemona Taylor, who is the Deputy Director of County Library Services at the Marin County Free Library. And I'm Anya Kamenetz. I'm your host for the Tinkering Together podcast series and for this, Raemona Little-Taylor. I'm sorry for that. I'm your host for the Tinkering Together podcast series and for this fireside chat today. And we're going to kick it off with a couple of remarks from Mike to talk about the scope of this work.
Thank you, Anya, and thanks everybody for coming. I wanted just to say a few important words before we dig into our conversation. We need to acknowledge our gratitude and thanks to the National Science Foundation for making the Tinkering Together Festival possible. This was intended initially as a conference series, a face-to-face conference series pre-COVID, where we would bring like-minded individuals together from all parts of the early childhood ecosystem and have a 2-day face-to-face conference. Because of the pandemic, we have been able to shift pretty radically, but I think also pretty impactfully to this online festival. And so the National Science Foundation and your continued support has made this happen. I also want to thank the California Department of Ed and Department of Social Services for actually situating our work at the Exploratorium in the early childhood sphere. And a huge shout out to Claudia Caro Sullivan, who is the project director and the visionary for this part of the project. We have created, thanks to Claudia's guidance, we hope, a screen grab of a moment in time of what making and tinkering looks like in early childhood settings, and to talk about what the implications and future may look like. So thanks again for joining, and thanks, Anya, for helping us with this.
My pleasure. It's been so fun to be on this journey with you and all of you. And I hope that you check out the podcast series online. As we mentioned, this originally was going to be, all face-to-face together. I hope everybody knows how to use the chat function or the Q&A. Either way, they're both good ways to raise questions, which we're going to definitely try to get to. And so please feel free to drop them in the chat anytime. So we're going to start with a question for each panelist to answer, which I had coming into this project, which is, what is tinkering? What are the non-negotiable elements of this pedagogy or approach to learning, and particularly for early childhood? And Ihuoma, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you so much, Anya. So I work with children from 18 months to 5 years old. And tinkering it looks like playful experimentation. And their play is driven by curiosity. And half the time, the challenges and the problems are self-defined. And as they play, they experiment and learn about the phenomena that they're interested in. It could be weight, it could be balance, it could be ramps and rollers, but the engagement is iterative and it's constantly changing as they observe and reflect on the things that they've done, and they add on to this work as they discover new understandings and create understandings of what they've been able to experience hands-on. And I think that's the key here, because they have to have direct contact with their play. As they learn, they construct these understandings, and it looks like it's not purposeful, but it is. And the more they do it and they revisit, they get even deeper, and they create this understanding of what they've been able to, work on. And it's really beautiful to see over a period of time how children start from one place and get to the other with lots of failures in between. Like the failure becomes part of the learning process. And you can't get from point A to B without making a mistake. And they learn from these mistakes, and it becomes part of what they're learning. So they find out many ways not to do that thing as part of their learning. And it's just great to see when they just take on the challenge and don't give up.
Wonderful. I love it. You've got kids as the protagonist in your description.
Correct.
Of tinkering. And Raemona, what would you add on to that?
Oh, I love what Ihuoma said about play. And I think for our space, we really focus on play as a child's work. That's what they do. That's what they naturally, that's just how they are, is that play is how they interact with the world. So that really is the lens that we enter with around tinkering. And we also see the children as experts. It's not the staff, we don't have a hierarchical system. Our staff and team, we learn from the children every day in our spaces, and they teach us so much about how to engage with the world and how to see it. I think one thing to note that's distinctive between our program and a early learning program is that the parents are on the learning bus with the children. So a lot of the barriers are when the parents want to interject and take over the activity from the child. So I think that is, the challenge that our staff really support, the parents, and seeing that, this is the child's experience, and, the lens and how they, want to draw a picture is, their truth, as opposed to what the parent or anyone else thinks that they should be drawing or playing or tinkering or engaging, that there's no prescriptive way. It is however the child wants to enter that space.
Getting grownups to hold back was a big theme in the podcast. I mean, parents, but also teachers sometimes, and a learning point, I think. Mike, what do you have to add to that?
Wow, there's not much to add. This is a great start. I would say, Raemona, it's great. We talk about parental takeovers. And I think in a tinkering environment, it's really interesting because it's not exactly the way that most parents experience learning in school. And so we spend as much time, I think, designing and trying to support meaningful, purpose-driven, playful experiences for children to engage in, as well as spend time trying to model facilitation and trying to model and work with the parents to figure out what it is that they might do to play alongside or to collaborate with in important ways. I think for us, the non-negotiables have already been mentioned. I just kind of want to repeat what you've all talked about. This idea of play being so key and critical to a disposition that we want children and adults to bring into the future. That leads to innovation, that leads to new thinking, it leads to, I think, an increased confidence and ability in your idea and way to play with ideas. I think this sort of a purposeful focus for exploration, I think Ihuoma talked about exploring and playing with something, with a purpose that is actually driven by the child and directed by the child in those ways. And I can't not talk about the role of collaboration. And oftentimes we think about collaboration as a tinkering experience might allow for children to build something together or to build something side by side and learn from each other. And you've both talked about sort of the role of collaboration between the adult and the child in terms of learning from each other. Not just learning from the adult or the expert, but actually learning about each other through the work that you're doing. So those are some key tenets that I think are emerging in really nice ways.
When I was trying to understand what tinkering was, we talked a lot about the materials. And I wonder, I mean, none of you guys mentioned the cardboard tubes and the balls and the hair dryers. Like, how important is that stuff?
The exploration space is very important. One of the phrases that is really common amongst educators is that the environment is a third teacher. So when you have an environment that has been intentionally set up as a provocation to invite children to just allow their creative genius fly, it does something for a child. Like, you walk into a space and you have this unstructured time and all these materials to just explore at your, however you just want to use it. And when adults or the educators around them really, think on that belief that all children can learn, and if you give them the opportunity, the time and the space to do so, they will rise up to that expectation and even go further than you think. And so having those materials set up in a way, or just collecting materials that you want children to participate in just exploring what that phenomenon might be, they can take it in different directions, and you just never know what the outcome will be. But you do know that as they explore, they will construct their own understanding of that phenomenon.
I love that. I'm putting that on my quote list. The environment is the third teacher. Mike or Raemona, do you think that tinkering can take place virtually?
Raemona, go ahead.
I think it depends on the age, like what the age of the child or adult, whoever we're talking about. I think that, I think a lot of what we discussed about the hands-on, I think that's difficult to replicate, and particularly for young children who really thrive off of, in person, seeing things and touching them in real time. So I entered this space humble and won't say that I'm an expert, but for us, it really is important that, tinkering occurs in real time and not virtually for young children as our focus, looking at their developmental, stages and where they're at and what's ideal.
I think I would just add that if I think about virtual, one of the things I think about is also connected to the materiality question. And that is, what are some of the online tools or experiences that might be tinkered with? Now, I don't know in terms of early childhood how appropriate or how we can work together to make this work, but something like the Scratch programming language and Scratch Junior, these are digital tools that children are tinkering with. They're on an iPad, or they're sort of on a screen, on a network. And I think there the materials are the ideas about coding and the way that ideas and programs could be built out to express your ideas or to build an animation. And so I think I think we should talk about both what Raemona and Ihuoma were talking about, this idea of the natural and direct relationship between children, adults, and materials. But then what are the opportunities to be thinking about how children might explore with some of these digital tools and ideas? They have to be very carefully constructed. Again, Scratch, I think, is a great example of a tool that can be expressive, personally meaningful, and constructive in nature. So it's for me, it's an open question, but an intriguing one to kind of go deeper on.
Beautiful, beautiful. I didn't mean that as a provocation. I was just curious.
Yeah, no.
And it's a great segue to talking about the different settings. We're here across different the scope of informal learning, the preschool, the library, the museum. What are the affordances of each type of setting? And what do you feel like you miss in your setting that you think takes place in other kinds of tinkering settings, perhaps? Raemona, I'd love to hear from you first, because I know the least about what you do.
Oh yeah, happy to talk about it. I think libraries definitely have a long history of systemic racism and inequities, and we saw there's a lot of gatekeeping that happened in our physical spaces that we are now in the process of unpacking all of that past trauma and harm. So the Learning Bus is a mobile preschool program of the library.
I'll share some of the images while you talk. All right, Ihuoma?
Oh, great.
All right.
Of the library. And so it's actually a mobile vehicle that drives around the county and brings the preschool experience to families who may not have access to a more formal program. What is unique and also critical to the success of this program is that we do hire early childhood educators to lead the program. So it's not librarians interpreting what they think early childhood education is. It's actual, preschool teachers who are deeply rooted in the pedagogy of early childhood, and that's their expertise. And they are the ones who run the program. So I think that's important to note. And I just wanted to state that this isn't libraries, interpreting early childhood, that we do hire the experts who understand early childhood and who have worked in childhood centers and preschool programs, and then they design the program and teach us how to integrate early childhood, best practices and principles into this program. So I'm sorry, I got distracted by the pretty photos of the learning bus. So what was the other part of the question, Anya? I'm so sorry if I didn't answer it.
Well, I mean, you talked about what you're bringing that's special. I mean, what's the nature of the engagement with these kids? Is it occasional? Is it recurring?
Okay, yes, good question. So we have 11 stops that we do weekly. We only see the children for 45 minutes to an hour. So this is not meant to replace an actual 8-hour preschool program, which I think that is something that's different from preschool and daycare centers, is that it is just a snapshot, and it's meant to infuse some support to families who don't have access to a program. And our staff also refer them to programs that have openings and that, they've served that role. So we're not meant to replace, it's just a supplement and an extension of what the library can do in support of the community. And so they're there, it's 15 minutes, there's circle time, there's, singing, play, talk, reading, singing, play, all of that happens in 45 minutes. And then they see the families, the next week and engage with them in between, with supports. But we do see families who will stay with us from, in the womb until they're 5. And we do, I think that's part of the success of the program is that the families come back. And I think, it's a lot more meaningful to some families than the traditional story time at the library, which is just like, again, that sometimes can feel like that gatekeeping of, I am the librarian, I am doing story time, you're here, yada, 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 and then you leave. Whereas with the learning bus, you really are, the families are, in that environment that's really intentional, as Ihuoma said, and focus on play. It's not about how many books you check out or that transaction that can really happen in a lot of traditional library settings. It's really about, the connectivity and supporting the families playing together.
Thanks for that. Ihuoma, when our interview in the podcast, you talked a lot about sort of the arc and seeing kids, in the cycle, I guess, of tinkering and seeing kids engage in it over time and learn over time. Is that something that you feel like is very special to the preschool setting?
Definitely is. Like one of the ways equity looks like is in the how of the teaching or learning. And we talked about having a space, a space to just allow this learning happen. So at my program, we have an atelier, a maker space where this happens. And this space is dedicated to just having the children have a structured time to just explore, be creative. And so the educators that are supporting them here have a mindset on how to get there. And that's where the conversations happen, because every child comes to school with something more than their backpack. They come with their stories, their experiences, their cultures. And as they approach just tinkering, they all tinker differently based on their experiences. And so a teacher in the classroom has to be aware of these differences as they work with the children to support their work. And it's amazing how the outcomes can be when a teacher realizes or understands a child's story, and so is able to support that child get through whatever difficulty the child may be having. So maybe a child may be presented with something that they've never tried before. Say they're trying to balance something and they've never tried balancing anything. And maybe all they know about balancing is my mom folds towels and in a straight stack. That's their story. That's their experience. While another child may say, hey, I've used a hoverboard before, or an EV scooter. So those experiences are different, but they are different perspectives of the same thing. And having teachers just be aware and support the child where they're coming from with their unique stories and their unique perspectives, it bridges that gap of the understanding that may happen when you experience a different subject that you're exploring together. So that's one really key factor that we have, since our population is very diverse. There are people from all walks of life, different socioeconomic status, different races, English as a second language, neurodivergent children, and neurotypical. It's all a huge mix. And so the adults who facilitate these conversations and these activities need to be really aware that all children are different and they all deserve to learn. And how do you get from point A to point B? So that's, I think, one of the huge things, just having the environment, having a teacher who's very aware. And another thing that we do so much is documentation. This is an aspect of just listening, observing, and reflecting as you work with the children. While working with children, sometimes you miss a lot of things. But when you take notes, take pictures, take videos, and the teacher is also a co-researcher as the child. When you revisit these documentations, you're able to notice things and have more understanding of the child, of what took place, what you missed. And when you revisit the same activity, you can take that understanding with you and apply it in those new settings. And those are some of the things that close that gap that we have in the classroom with all the inequities that we may possibly have. And it's something that we really hold dear and true in our child care center. And it's something that all the staff believe, that they see the image of the child as strong and capable and resilient. And so we apply that same thinking to the children and in the work that they do. And Raemona mentioned parent participation, parent takeovers. It's also another image we have of parents, that parents are competent and they're also reaching ideas to support their children through these things as well. So as children have their own different cultures and perspectives, so do parents too. And we try to encourage them to participate in the learning as well. And when you have a tag team of the educator, the parent, the child, there's so much you can achieve.
It's beautiful. It's so beautiful. So we're learning about this mobile learning resource that's kind of dropping into kids' lives and giving them something exciting, something out of their ordinary. And then you're talking, Ihuoma, about a community that you're building of people, all different kinds of people coming together regularly and in dedicated space. Mike, what are your thoughts about the museum as a setting for tinkering?
Yeah, it's great, and hopefully we'll sort of reflect what we've heard. I'll share just a few images. I think for us, the question is, and the challenge is, how to take all of what we've just heard and embed it into a program that actually can take place in the Exploratorium as a bit of a learning laboratory. So the Tinkering Studio on the floor of the Exploratorium is a drop-in setting for families, and that means learners of all ages to be playing and working together. And although we're designing interesting experiences for and with children, it's ultimately about trying to share that relationship between the caregiver and the child. And so in the explorations that children are carrying out, trying to support the renewed ideas and understanding that a child may have about their caregiver or a caregiver may have about their child is key. I think engaging in experiences that are material-based, that parents don't have to collect in order to have these experiences, but actually are ready for children and adults to dive into and play with, is key. And it's important that we're doing it with materials that don't feel like they're built by experts. We're using, again, recycled materials and everyday objects in unusual and playful ways so that anybody, whether it's an educator or another museum developer or a parent, understands that some of these materials can be sort of mind-blowing in their creative uses. And I think finally, to model the relationship that parents have with children is something that is important for the caregivers or the parents, but it's also important to us at the Exploratorium as a professional development model. So ultimately, anything that we experiment with at the Exploratorium is immediately impactful and relevant to the communities that we're working with. That's community center programs, it's our library partners, it's our burgeoning and important collection of early childhood leaders in various forms that are working in homes and in centers. And so ultimately, if the work that we're doing is impactful and meaningful in those ways, then I think we have both an interesting drop-in program for families, but we also have, I think, an important and impactful professional development message and opportunity to share online, and now that we're coming out of the pandemic a bit, back face to face.
So you're tinkering, you're a space where you're tinkering with tinkering.
I think that's what I'm learning from Ihuoma. That's what I'm learning from Raemona. In all of this work, they're tinkering with their practice, and I think that's a message that we share pretty broadly.
Anya, before we move on, I'm really am appreciating the comments about the role of the parent or caregiver in this experience with their child. And I did just want to note that something for the learning bus is really about honoring that relationship. I think that, I can be honest, I was being honest about the parent takeover, which happens, but I think that the root of that is not in the parent, it's about the systems. The system says that the children have to do this in a certain way, and there's only one way to do it right. And I think that's what the parents are responding to. And that's what our space and our, educators are trying to undo. That narrative is about, like, there's one way to do this. So I did want to, I was feeling in my spirit that I may have dishonored the role of the parents. So I did want to name that is, near and dear to our heart. And the system is what has impacted parents to respond in that way when engaging with their children in tinkering and play.
I love that point. And I mean, I think as someone, I look a lot at sort of parenting instructions for parenting, the messages that we get, which are often dominant culture messages. And actually, parents at all socioeconomic levels get this message that their kids are supposed to perform things well and do things well and follow rules and show up well, especially in front of strangers. And so I think that pressure is just something a lot of us fight as caregivers of young children. So I do want to, this is a great segue, actually. Both of you have named, and all three of you have named and talked about equity and how it plays into the work that you do. But, this question came up around tinkering. And I think in the context when this project was birthed, especially, but it's always a good time to talk about this. But, whether tinkering, it's not overtly political, right? There's not content here that is cultural in nature in the way that we think about culture. And yet, what do you perceive as far as the nature of tinkering as a practice that can be inclusive or be empowering or give different kinds of children agency? That would be the broadest way of putting it. Another way of asking the question would be, what kind of people are we trying to create with tinkering? What kind of society are we trying to create with tinkering? If every child did this, what kind of world would we get out of it?
Well, I'll jump in and say, for us, it's deeply important that two things are happening in our work and that we continue to learn about. And that is, first, what is the meaning of tinkering and what is the relevancy of this educational approach in communities and cultures that I'm not a part of? And so it's deeply important for us to make sure that we're actually understanding and co-collaborating and creating with spaces, places, and people that bring their perspective. If this work is not culturally relevant, if it's not linguistically accessible, and if it doesn't actually reflect the values of those in the communities that want to support this type of learning, then I think we're not doing our job well. And so that is at the forefront of everything we do. I would also say that equity is also personal in that an equitable approach or a social justice approach to teaching and learning is not dictated. It's not a didactic approach to teaching. And so I think tinkering, playful learning, constructionism, whatever we want to call it, ultimately, as Ihuoma and Raemona both said, it's about looking at the child and providing opportunities that we believe they're capable of exploring and complexifying. And if we have that belief, that's inherently an equitable stance to begin with. And if our goal as educators is to better understand what their thinking is and how to motivate and support their thinking in more and more complex ways over time, or more and more creative ways over time, or in more social ways over time, I think that's an important idea for us to carry. But we've got to support children to express that for themselves, and we can't get ahead of them and we can't lead them too closely. I would say that the children, whether they're teens or early or young learners, that we care most about are those that are already falling through the cracks, and they're getting remedial, rote, sort of after school and summer school programs. And the question is, if you've got somebody who's actually not quite doing well as a school student, what are the options that they have to actually engage in ways that are much more tactile, much more meaningful, and much more expressive? And so I believe that if we could actually sort of make this a broader understanding for the educational community and the informal community, then we'll be doing a pretty good job.
Oh, there's not much more to add to all of that.
Except for how it actually plays out with your actual students, right?
Yes. Okay. So I know I touched on equity in the classroom and the role of the teacher. So one of the really key points here is actually the role of the teacher to validate every child's curiosity, because every child shows their curiosity in different ways. There might be a child who's just quiet and sitting in a corner and just observing. It's the teacher at that point where you realize that that silence is not being, no, I'm not interested. It means I'm hesitant to try because maybe at home I'm not allowed to touch things. Yeah. So it's the role of the teacher is very vital here, because like Mike said, equity is literally almost in the eyes of the beholder, because it looks different for every different child. So how do you support the child bridge that gap? And so, so there are different things that the Child Care Center does. Of course, you create opportunities for this learning to happen. And then you have an adult in that supports the learning and facilitates while this happens. And also building a very strong relationship with each family and each child to know what their stories and experiences are, so that you can support them to the next place. Also, having the conversations about what inequities could look like for different races, different genders, different socioeconomic status. It looks that conversation, having that conversation with the staff, with the families. What does this look like? What are your expectations? What are your values? Just knowing what the value systems are help us in our work for the children, because we can talk about tinkering, but if a family is not even aware of what tinkering can look like in their own homes, it's really hard to support that family want to engage in a program that the school may set up for everyone. They'll say, I don't know what tinkering is, and I don't do that, so I don't need to be here, I'll pass. But just having these conversations, educating your community to tell them more stories, like people learn from stories, telling them about their children, what their children are learning, what that looks like in its application in real life. Making those connections helps them. Like, for example, we had a project where children were experimenting and exploring ramps and rollers, which several children could not create one. And then we took a neighborhood walk and they could see an actual off-ramp from the bridge. And they were able to make the connection that, ramps go from a high place to a low place. And what does that mean? It means if I understand this, I could actually use this to further my need to become an engineer in the future. I could create bridges. I could be an architect. I could design things. And so showing them and sharing the stories with them of how something that looks so simple actually grows to become something bigger, like in the future, and having children understand that they are relevant, their ideas are important, and everyone around them validates those feelings and also celebrates their success. Because I think adults don't realize how much children rely on our feedback. If you were to celebrate a child's success right now, and that's goes beyond that moment, because we know learning and tinkering can be frustrating. It can be challenging. Mm-hmm. But if a child takes joy out of the times when they were successful, they will push through those times when it's difficult and know that there's something better waiting at the end of the line if I persist. And so they're able to get there. And so there's a lot that the adults around us do to get this support different children in the different spaces they're in and bridge this gap.
It sounds like what you're telling me is that it's not automatic. It's very intentional, the support of equity and the support of empowering all different children.
Correct.
And then it's not going to be embedded in the lesson plan or even in the materials or the curriculum itself.
Correct.
Well, not on its own, but what you're saying is exactly right. Every consideration has to be made in terms of what we're offering for materials, the space that we're creating, the conversations that we're having, and where we find relevancy in our lives. I think, Raemona, that's one of the things that we learned from you all at the Learning Bus, like being in the community and having conversations with the caregivers is so key because of that level of shared understanding and sort of movement.
Yeah, we, in addition to everything you all have said already, our program is built on building trust with families as the core. That's where it all has to start, is if the families don't feel like they trust the program, the staff, the space, then they're not going to show up or they're not going to participate and engage. So we start with building trust, and that's the teacher, the educators, they do that. I'm an administrator. They build trust with the families because they're, frontline. And then from there, once that trust is built, that's where we can, I think in multiple spaces, whether it's senior self-reflected at staff, in language access, in materials that are responsive and reflect your culture and your background and values, as Ihuoma said, all of that matters. Our staff hand select every single book with the families and all that they bring in mind. And, they're not just pulling from lists. They do that thinking about each family. The wrap of the bust, the graphics, has elements of children who have been in our program, because that's how intentional the staff were. They were like, there were children who went through, a very hard time with not wanting to wear their glasses. And we were like, we want, the staff were supporting the parents through that process, because we were finding the glasses on the bus, and the families were like, I think they're hiding them because they're, don't feel that, they don't feel comfortable wearing them. And so our staff person took time out of, the day-to-day to really connect with the child around wearing glasses herself. And that's just one minor example. But I think that, from my level, my perspective, I really focus on these big pictures, systemic inequities, which translates into where does the bus go? Marin County is incredibly wealthy, healthy, and incredibly segregated and incredibly inequitable. And all of those things matter, because, and how we infuse into our program is literally where the vehicle goes. We could never sustain supporting every single community. So we focus on the communities that have been most impacted by the systemic inequities and being excluded from participation and having access to many things. And that's where we root ourselves and root the work, because those are the communities where we see we can make the greatest impact, focusing on the child, strength and, access. So that's sort of in a nutshell how equity, shows up in our program. But really the staff, they show, don't tell, that's what they do. It's in their work, it's in what they do. And they're like, we leave that to you, Raemona, to talk about it. They're like, we just do it because it's just part of how we engage with children and families.
I love that. And this seems very relevant, this question from the chat about gender differences in tinkering. And Ihuoma, I wonder if you would take this and tell us about the blocks that are wrapped in pink paper, because I really love that.
Okay, several years ago, this came up in one of the classrooms where the girls wouldn't participate in any tinkering or block play or just anything that just required just putting things together and imagining and, you know, creating something and keep testing it out. And the teachers wondered, what do we need to do to get the girls also involved in this? Are we participating as well? Are we showing joy and sparking curiosity for them? And what are the steps to take to, you know, get them to, excuse me, naturally want to do these things? So for the block play area, we had observed that the children, the girls mostly like pink items, and they would gravitate towards, you know, Barbie and things like that. And so we wrapped up the blocks in pink paper, and suddenly they were building castles. Like, okay, so this was the vehicle to get them to do these things. And as time progressed, the teachers will show so much joy in doing things, and the girls will want to know, what are you doing? I want to do it too, because of that shared relationship. And so we realized that just approaching activities with joy and curiosity also got the children to want to participate, because they want to be with their favorite person or favorite teacher, and they come along and they observe, and after a while they get into it. And so right now we've moved away from that conversation of gender, who participates and who does not, because right now the girls are actually elbowing the boys out to participate in those things. And so we really realized that the teachers' experiences too played a huge and vital role, because if you have a teacher who shied away from math and science and things like that, and probably loves art and literacy, that would also reflect in the classroom. And so at our program, we had conversations about just diving in. You may not be comfortable, but see yourself as a co-researcher with the child, where you're on equal terms and you're approaching it together. And fear has no space here. We're going to figure it out together. Let's go do this together. And without the pink, we've moved beyond that point. But it takes a mindset of growth to say, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to level the playing field for the girls and the boys in the classroom equally, because sometimes you have boys who don't want to do any dress up, and you get them thinking they're the next master chef. And I think that it's just really important for the educators to support children bridge that gap, and also support parents too, to have a different outlook on what these things can look like. Girls can build too. They can tinker, and they tinker in different ways. They can sew, design clothes for their dolls as well. And they can also drive a tractor.
Could I jump in just with one other quick tip? Just because one of the things that we learned early on is not only to make sure not to design things for boys, which is so common in so much of construction-based experiences. I don't think very much, of that has happened lately. But one of the things that we care so much about in designing the tinkering experiences is that we try to get to this point where there's a gender neutral but both relevant and interesting to boys and girls. Here's an example of a bit of wind that's coming through a bunch of big boba straws, and they're creating this beautiful sort of cushion of air, and children are constructing objects to float on the cushion of air. I don't think this is for boys or for girls, but this is actually designed for both. But more importantly, this is the group of designers. These are my colleagues in the tinkering studio, who are actually not only not men, not all men, but what they're doing is exactly what we're hoping children and learners do with these experiences. We're engaged deeply in the phenomenon and the experiences that we would like others to have. And if we're not paying attention ourselves to what our own instincts are about what we love and what we're interested in as men and women, boys and girls, I think it's hard to design for the other gender or for someone else. And so I think Raemona talked about making sure that people who are leading the program look like me. Let's make sure that we can pay attention to how that level of diversity can continue to play out at all levels of these programs.
Love that. I have another question for the panelists, but I also have a nudge for our attendees, because this is meant to be participatory. We want you guys to elbow up to the table and get in there. So one question I have for you is anything that you're hearing that makes you say, yeah, but if there's something that you don't think it would work in your setting, or you don't really think that kids can do that, or there's a reason that I can't do this. That's what I want to, I'd love to hear those questions, those objections, or just anything that you don't quite understand of what you've heard or don't quite agree with. I'd love to hear. Oh, that's a great question. We've got gender diversity, right? Not everybody's a boy or a girl or identifies that way, of the teachers and the students. Anyone who's had an experience with that wants to speak to that?
I can jump in, briefly and say that, our team has really been very conscious of the language we use to describe, and they do adopt, gender neutral language because, we want the child to tell us, to identify themselves, as opposed to staff, assuming that they know. And so I think that's how we at the library hold space, is that, we don't refer to boys, girls, men, women, any of that. It's all, friends, co-conspirators, comrades, language that is gender neutral, so that staff aren't identifying. Yeah.
I would say we're making every effort to do that as well. And with us, the conversations emerge because of the adults that come into the space and how they are associating gender to their children or to other children in the space. And so it's an active conversation that we're learning as much about as quickly as we can, out of respect and deference to that.
I'd love to talk to this for a sec for my own reporting, because I did it specifically in early childhood. There is a very strong gender sorting that's happening where kids are identifying as one gender or the other. And there's a lot of that is socialized, and parents are often taken aback, right, of this very strong kind of sorting. Why is my child obsessed with princesses? Why is my child wearing a tutu? Why is my child obsessed with toy guns? And it really is a mirror for us to think about how gendering works in our society. And because there's a false belief that this is natural to the child. They're so young. How can they be just, they're just different, where actually we've been socializing them from infancy, and then they start mirroring it back because they're interested in categories and they're interested in identity and what is mutable, what is immutable about identity, what can be changed, what can be not changed. That's what they want to know. And I've talked to friends who are dismayed by their children's gender performance and said, your 4-year-old is like a drag queen, like she's performing gender. She's getting really excited about the performance of gender and her identity. And this can be temporary, it can change. And so it's so wonderful to have these kinds of activities in early childhood that aren't sorted, that aren't labeled, pre-labeled, where children can feel that freedom to wherever they end up. So yeah, that's just my random thoughts on that topic. But
Anya, I think this goes back again to the approach and attitude. Are we going to presume to know what a child needs in terms of their learning? Do we presume to know what they need or need to know about science or a topic like that? And we can't presume to know how they identify and who they are for themselves and to each other. And so again, I think it's a constant practice, and it's important to sort of build into every part of the decisions that we make about facilitation, activity design, and environmental setup. But has to be ultimately an equitable stance toward not presuming to know what's good for the other person. We do care about meaningful and strong experiences that children and adults can have, but knowing how to get there can't come from my perspective alone. And so that's what we're learning with our colleagues and collaborators.
I feel like too, that it's also the adults looking back at themselves, that, this idea that, about early childhood educators, it's like, why does it matter that I don't like math? I'm teaching a 4-year-old. I know all the math that they need to know, but somehow my identity is tied up in this, and my affinity is tied. Maybe it makes more sense if it's your actual child, but this happens with teachers and children, which is fascinating to me. but I'm gonna move to the last question, which is a framing and a prompt. And we came up with this in the prep talk, and then Mike said that you guys already do this as part of your vocabulary. So that's wonderful, which is what in the process of getting involved with tinkering as a practice, what have you changed your mind on, or what's reframed, or what have you learned? So the question is, I used to think this, and now I think this.
I used to think that tinkering was very frustrating for young children. But now I think that the frustration is actually valuable. It supports the child grow grit. And that's what they really need in future, to be able to, problem solve and derive great joy from solving their own problems, and just celebrating those aha moments when they do get them, and not giving up. That's what I've learned.
Love it.
I'll go. I used to think that tinkering required a lot of technical skill and expertise. And now I think that, anyone can tinker, and tinkering is happening all the time, even if it's not described as tinkering, or if the tinkering, language is not used, that it's happening everywhere all the time, and that there are entry points for everyone.
And this will show sort of the blinders I had on. I used to think that tinkering was about experiences for children, teens, and adults that could communicate to each other clearly about how their ideas are immediately changing, and build out and explore and experiment. And that it was required that you actually had that discourse to really deeply understand the change in my understanding of circuits, or a change in my understanding about the way something is constructed. And now I've realized that tinkering is early childhood experience. It is at its core the way that children come to understand the world in natural and important ways. And to be now part of the early childhood community in order to deeply understand better for us what the developmental implications are, what the social implications are. It's a gift that in one way I'm saying, why do we wait so long before jumping into this sphere? But I feel like I couldn't be more excited about the directions and the future of this work, especially together with folks like all of you.
Cool. I used to think tinkering was an activity. And now I think it's a worldview. Yeah. I think it's a way of being. And it's not just a way of being for children. It's a way of approaching the whole world. So Casey's got a question for Ihuoma and for Raemona. How do you support adults in their evolution and to being co-learners with the children?
Sometimes it takes just diving right in. If you've never tried something, try it. And one of the prompts that we have for adults is, what surprised you? Because sometimes adults always think of, this perfect thing or, goal that they have to reach. But the question may be, what surprised you? What did not work? And they tell you all the ways that it didn't work. And then, so how can you, what will you do differently? So having these questions supports the adult participate, knowing that there's no right or wrong way. There's 100 different ways to do this. And you may just find the 101st way to get it done. But I think it's just supporting adults as well to know that it's okay. It's okay to make mistakes. And it's okay not to arrive at a point where you did not imagine yourself, getting. And when they also find their own joy, they let go of all the fears and all the stresses and actually start enjoying themselves and enjoy being silly and goofy and discovering something new with a child.
+1 to all of that. And yes, Ihuoma inspires me too. I definitely plan to email you after this. The only thing I can add to that, which I learned from the team that leads the Learning Bus, is one practical thing that they do is they will provide materials for the parent or caregiver, because sometimes maybe the parent just wants to color as well or wants to paint with the child. And so that's one practical tool that's really helped on the bus. It's just honestly having materials for the adults as well to be able to engage as learners too with the activity.
Love that. That's very practical. So there's this question of what is the difference between how children and adults engage in tinkering? And I would maybe segment out children younger and older if you have that experience.
My initial response, I think this is our friend Sara in Italy. For me, it's paying attention to how the child is expressing their understanding, their curiosity, and their observations. Because it's more likely that a young child who is even pre-verbal or is developing their language ability will actually express those ideas through actions. They'll reach for objects, they'll express the way that they're maybe making a shadow on the wall. And I think for parents, caregivers, and for educators of young children, well, you need to deeply understand that. I would also say for older kids and for teens, they're really good at playing right at school. So they'll tell you what they think you want to hear from them. And so even though they have the language and they can sort of tell you what they think is going on, for tinkering experiences, to actually put materials in front of them and ask them to demonstrate how to construct the circuit or how to actually build out their light play experience will tell you kind of immediately whether or not they're really understanding and sort of deeply motivated by the phenomenon that they're exploring. So to me, it's about the express ways that children, teens, and adults are communicating with you about what they're curious about, what they're thinking about at that moment, and what the aha moments are. You can tell it in a child's eyes when they have that aha moment. You can tell it in an adult's eyes as well, these transformational moments that, as Ihuoma talked about, we really want to support parents to have.
Another thing I wanted to add is the difference for children and adults is that it's for the child, it's mostly about the process, and for the adult is the product. And so if they have this set product in their head, it's really hard for them to, just take a detour. But for the child, it's like anything works, add more, put this, put that. Just like the marshmallow challenge, they just go for it. And when it crashes, it's fun. But for the adults, it's like, oh my God, I have to start again. And so, but it takes some time to get beyond that and just allow yourself, just go through the process.
Beautiful, beautiful. So should we end on this question of what input do you get from the users? What feedback do you get from the people who show up, and what changes have you made as a result?
I'll just answer quickly. In the tinkering studio, there is no tinkering development without the direct and immediate feedback from all users. And so we're out there facilitating continuously because not only are we curious about what children and adults are thinking and learning about, but in seeing how they're using the materials to see what questions emerge and what suggestions they have about relevancy. We immediately implement that all the time. So without that feedback, I don't think we're as successful as we need to be.
Fantastic.
Raemona's about to say something.
Yes.
No, I was just going to say the same. The staff are, so embedded in the community and with the families that they have just an ongoing feedback loop. And they do, invite and engage the families in designing the programs with them on the bus, since, it's a bit more informal. So, and leading,
Excellent.
Okay.
Yes. No, please.
I was just going to share that one of the parents' participation moments that we had, a parent told me, this is the most fun I've had with my child while learning. And that was because the child was teaching her like this is what happens when you do this, like, you know. So just being able to be a co-learner with her child and actually listen, that moment was something that she really treasured. And the parents left, you know, for the day. They were really grateful for the opportunity to actually see their children as experts in something that they did not realize. And so that was just very beautiful to see and witness.
That's so nice to hear. I love that. So I think we're at the end here. I love everyone's comments. Thanks for such a great discussion. I'm dropping in the chat the information about the tinkering workshops tomorrow, making spinning tops at 10 a.m. and another workshop at 2 p.m. And tinkeringtogether.org to find out more. And thanks again for joining us. This has been really, really fun.